Turn mine off.
Hello? Oh, it was muted. One of the best things about the book of Ruth is seeing how people pronounce that name Salmon, seeing if they say salmon, like Andy did, or salmon. I think some people would say salmon. What did you say last week, Colin? Did you say salmon? Did you say salmon? Salmon, there we go. I noticed you were wearing a salmon-coloured hoodie last week. Anyway, we're in our final week of the book of Ruth, this amazing little book. And this morning we're going to kind of wrap things up. And we began a few weeks ago in a really dark place, didn't we? The first 5 verses, we saw this widow called Naomi. And we saw that she was in one of the most helpless situations that any human being could find themselves in. But we then saw that God had not abandoned her. And as we've journeyed with her through this book, through the book of Ruth, we have seen God using his people to bring healing. We learned a bit of Hebrew, didn't we, along the way? We learned the word hesed, which is a kind of self-sacrificial, loyal love that many of the characters in the book show each other. We've seen a community following God's law in a way that brings enormous blessing to people in need. But mostly, we've heard about a loving God who sometimes seems to be hidden, doesn't he? But he's working through everyday circumstances, the kindness of normal people, to bring restoration and redemption to those who have taken shelter under his wings. Last week we saw, Colin showed us the final piece of restoration in this book, a grandson for Naomi called Obed. Obed would take care of Naomi in her old age, would provide for her, and so the restoration, the redemption has kind of been completed for Naomi and her family. But the story doesn't end there at all. In fact, the verses we're looking at today show us why the book of Ruth is such an important part of the Bible. These final few verses, it's basically a little family tree. They show us that this story is so much bigger than it seems. In fact, I think we're going to see that the story of Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi is actually a story about a restoration project that God is working on for the entire world. A restoration project that will not be stopped by anything. Passage is up on the screen. I've broken it into 3 sections. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at these 3 things. We're going to look at what this tells us, what these list of names tells us about God and his unstoppable project of restoring his world. We're going to see firstly that God has promised restoration. We're going to see that God has brought restoration. And then we're going to see that God will bring restoration. That will make more sense as we go through. Because this family tree does 3 things at the end of Ruth. It reaches back into the past to remind us of God's promises that he would provide a king, someone to bring restoration to Israel, to his people. Then in the middle, when we look at Ruth and Boaz, it reminds us of the restoration that he's brought to that one family in Bethlehem. But it also looks to the future, to when this nasty time of the judges has finished and God has brought about a kingdom defined by peace, prosperity, and self-sacrificial, loyal love. The kingdom of Hesed. And we're going to see that where we stand in history is very similar to where Ruth and Naomi did. Because we live in a partially restored world because of what Jesus has done on the cross. But we look forward to a much better kingdom defined by peace, prosperity, and self-sacrificial loyal love. As we look forward to a kingdom of Hesed. So today it's all about a king. It's all about a kingdom. Let's jump into the passage. So firstly, God has promised restoration. Have a look at verse 18. This then is the family line of... I'm going to stop there. Immediately, this introduces something that we call a genealogy. It's like a family tree. So the writer is trying to take our minds back to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, which, if you've ever read Genesis, it's a book completely riddled with genealogies. They're absolutely everywhere. You know, if you've ever woken up on New Year's Day, I'm sure lots of us done this. You wake up on New Year's Day and we're like, I'm going to do Bible in a year. I'm going to read Genesis. Woohoo! And then you open up your Bible, you get to day 2 and you get smashed with genealogies. Lists of names everywhere. You're like, why are they here? But Genesis is mainly a book of promises. The writer is reaching back into history to drag up into our memories the promises that God made long ago to his people. Because in the book of Genesis, we see a world falling further and further into evil, further into brokenness. We also see a God who doesn't want to let that happen. So he grabs a few helpers along the way to help him with a big restoration project to fix the broken world. One of these people is called Abraham. God makes a promise to Abraham. He says, through your descendants, the whole world will be blessed. So Abraham's family is going to bring restoration. But almost immediately, we see Abraham getting involved in some really dodgy stuff. He cheats on this promise a little bit by impregnating his slave. So it all gets a little bit weird. But God is not going to let human failure ruin his promise for restoration. So after a few more generations after Abraham, we get another promise to his great-grandson Judah. This promise is up on the screen. It says, the scepter, so that means the kingship, will not depart from Judah, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So we're going to get a king coming from Judah's family. So 2 promises so far. The promise to Abraham that God's going to bring someone to restore a broken world. Then God's promise to Judah that this is going to be a king who's going to rule over the nations. Okay, this is my really long way of introducing the first name on the list. Someone called Perez. Okay, hopefully that's not too small to see. Perez is Judah's son. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Do you know how Perez came about? Do you know how Perez was came into existence? His dad, Judah, who we just talked about, he went on a little detour one day, and he impregnated a cult prostitute. So it got a little bit messed up there as well. So we had Abraham doing slightly dodgy things, Judah doing slightly dodgy things. And this prostitute actually turned out to be his daughter-in-law, dressing up. And this child that came of it was called Perez, the first name in our genealogy. It's a bit of a disturbing start to a family tree, isn't it? But God was not going to let human failure ruin his promise to bring restoration to the world. If we keep going through the genealogy, we're going to see Hezron and Ram. Now, they grew up in Egypt. They would have grown up during the time when Israel was in Egypt. And then we had Amminadab. Amminadab would have grown up when the Israelites were under slavery in Egypt, when it looked really bleak for God's people. But God wasn't going to let an evil Pharaoh ruin his promise to bring restoration. So then the next name, Nahshon, he ends up leading the tribe of Judah through the wilderness with Moses. God keeps the promise of restoration going. He uses this family. Last week, Colin shared with us about this Salmon or Salmon or whatever we're going to call him, and said that we reckon he's the one that married Rahab, who was also a prostitute. Again, not a great career choice, but God wasn't going to let anything ruin his plan of restoration. And in fact, using all these broken people, don't we see how amazing God is to use them? And then Salmon's son, or Salmon, whatever we're going to call it, Salmon's son is Boaz. And now we're up to speed. Now we're up to the book of Ruth. Oops. Go back a slide. Now we're up to the book of Ruth. So as we look back at those generations leading up to Ruth and Boaz, we see that God has made a promise to bring restoration to the world through this family. Through the family of Perez. We see that God will not break his promise, no matter how bad they get, no matter how much they try to derail the plan, no matter how badly other people treat them. Because our God keeps his promises. Maybe you look at your life, maybe you worry that you've disrupted God's plans and purposes. Maybe you've got enormous regrets. Or maybe you've been treated terribly. Or maybe people have said things to you that make you feel useless and make you feel worthless. You don't think that God could possibly use someone like you. Or maybe you look at the world, or maybe you look at your life and you're waiting for things to change. You're wondering where on earth God is. Where is his restoration? Well, I believe that God would remind you this morning that nothing has or ever will be able to ruin his plans or purposes. Because we have a God who is in the business of redeeming broken situations. We have a God who is in the business of bringing restoration. And he will. Because nothing can get in the way of his promises. Oh, spoiler. Let's have a look at our second section then. God has brought restoration. Let's have a look at what this restoration has looked like in the book of Ruth. We've been looking at it now for 6 weeks, and this is where we've gotten up to in the genealogy. We've got up to Boaz. And then we're going to think about what this restoration means for us. So right at the beginning, as we said, we saw Naomi. We saw a lady alone in a foreign land with no future at all. And we saw then that God just seemed to be kind of missing from the story. Where was he? Was he hiding? Didn't he really care what was happening to Naomi? You know, we saw that Naomi thought he'd completely abandoned her. She was on track to grow old in Bethlehem, a lonely, bitter old woman. And then Ruth stepped in. We know what happened next. So where was God in the book of Ruth? Was he hidden? No, not at all. He was working with normal human beings to bring restoration. And then we heard about Boaz, didn't we? We all went, oh, that's lovely, romance. He was a relative who bought the land of Naomi's husband as a way of paying off her debts, or off their debts, to buy them out of poverty. And as part of this, we saw that he married Ruth. We saw that for Boaz, this was a massive risk, wasn't it? He had 2 extra mouths to feed, let alone any children that they might have had together. And there was many, many other things that could have gone wrong there. But Boaz, this kinsman redeemer, he didn't think twice, did he? Because no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, Boaz would bring redemption to Ruth and Naomi's lives. Boaz knew that he lived under the wings of God. We heard that phrase a few times throughout the book of Ruth. He knew the hesed of God in his own life, and he didn't hesitate to be the hesed of God to others. So again, that question, where was God in the book of Ruth? Was he hidden? No, not at all. He was working with normal human beings in normal situations to bring restoration. But for readers of the New Testament, there's more. Because Boaz is actually mentioned in the 5th verse of the New Testament. In Matthew 1, where he's said to be an ancestor of an even better kinsman redeemer. Jesus the Messiah. Do you know that word Messiah is another word for king? Jesus the King. How much is Boaz like our Jesus? God looked at the world that he had made, and he saw all of the evil, all of the wars, all of the ways that humans harm themselves and each other. He saw the rotten human heart. He saw that man produces evil like a bee produces honey. And he looks right at us, each of us sitting in this room. Can you imagine it? God, the most powerful being in the universe, looking right into your heart, seeing everything in there. Everything. Every thought, every word you've ever spoken, every selfish action. Seeing all those times that we showed hesed to ourselves rather than the people that needed it. God saw that each of us had racked up a moral debt that we'd never be able to pay back. If he gave us what we deserved, there'd be none of us left. But our God was moved with compassion. He loved us far too much to leave us as we were, because we have a God who is in the business of bringing restoration. So Jesus came to redeem us. Jesus counted the cost, just like Boaz. He knew what it would take to pay back what we owed, a moral debt that none of us could repay. And as he counted the cost in the Garden of Gethsemane, he saw the enormous weight of it. He saw it wouldn't just take a bit of pain. It wouldn't just cost his life. He saw that on the cross, he would need to lose his place under the wings of God so that we could shelter under them forever. He saw that he would need to be destroyed so that we could be restored. And he felt that weight so heavily that he sweated drops of blood. But he did it. He went to the cross, our kinsman redeemer, a greater Boaz. And in the first week, we talked a bit about the curse of death that we live under. It's all quite dark, isn't it? It's like a black bin bag that surrounds the earth. But we heard that Jesus removed it through his resurrection so that we don't need to be scared of it anymore. God has brought restoration, hasn't he? Hasn't he? Well, the thing is, Phil, you're saying this, and I do agree. Jesus has brought restoration to the world, defeated sin and death, our greatest enemies. Why is everything still so hard? Why am I still overwhelmed with fear all of the time? Why do I still get sick? Why is there still a war in Ukraine? Why is there still a war in my family? Why has everything still not been restored? We need to look at our final section to find out that God will bring restoration. So as we bring this series on Ruth to a close, let's have another look at that genealogy, that exciting list of names. There's the final few verses. It's like the epilogue. It's a really good ending to the story. I'm going to show you why. Because it shows us that the restoration that Ruth and Naomi experience is just a taste. It's just a taste of the bigger restoration that is to come. When God brings his king, David, into the world. I wonder if, when you were looking at that, if anyone thought it'd be fun to count how many generations there are. Anyone? No? No one did that? Oh, weird. Well, there's 10, I'll tell you. 10 generations listed. Now, if you'd heard the whole book in one sitting, you're thinking, I've heard that number 10 before. Where have I heard that number 10 before? Oh, yeah. Right at the beginning, Naomi lived in Moab for 10 years after the death of her husband. So 10 years of death in Moab has become 10 years of life in the epilogue at the end of the book. God has brought restoration. Now, Boaz is generation number 7. So if you were counting through, if anyone was doing that, thinking, where's Boaz? I wonder what generation he is. He's number 7. Now, after that, after Boaz, so after the events of Ruth, 3 more lives. We've got Obed, Jesse, and David. Where have we heard the number 3 before? You might be thinking back to the prologue again, to the first 5 verses. We had 3 deaths, didn't we? We had her husband, Naomi's husband, and her 2 sons. So again, 3 years of death has become 3 new lives for Naomi. God has brought restoration. So if you haven't kept up with me so far, let's have a look at it like this. Look, 10 years of death in Moab has become 10 generations of life in Bethlehem. 3 deaths for Naomi in Moab has become 3 new lives from Naomi for her family. So God's brought restoration. But it's only a partial restoration. We've been talking about that. It's only a partial restoration because we're still in the time of the judges. Okay, in Bethlehem, we've got people doing the right thing. We've got people looking after each other. But it's still surrounded by everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. So we see this tiny community living as if God is the king, but no one else is. Because outside there's pain, outside there's war, outside there's rape, and outside there's corruption. But if you were going to choose somewhere to live during that time, you'd probably choose Bethlehem, wouldn't you? Because in Bethlehem there's a taste of a bigger restoration project that God's working on. The restoration God brings in Bethlehem, it's like the trailer for a movie. The movie is going to be this kingdom, the kingdom of David, that God's promised, where he'll bring in just a few generations, the last name in our genealogy, he'll bring a kingdom of peace and prosperity where the poor don't stay poor, where widows and orphans are looked after, accepted and loved, and everyone has what they need. That's what David's bringing. But at the moment, Ruth and Boaz are right in the middle. This time in history, they stand right in the middle. They stand between the promise of restoration to Abraham, to Judah, and the fulfillment of that promise in the kingdom of David. They're right in the middle. And I believe that where we stand in history is pretty similar. Because we stand between the cross and the new heavens and the new earth, the redemption of the whole universe. There's a diagram to help us. To illustrate this a little bit, I've got a story about World War II, so history buffs, get excited. On the 6th of June, 1944, around 1,000 ships carried about 200,000 soldiers across the English Channel to France. And here they stormed the coast of Normandy. At the same time as that was happening, this big invasion, at the same time as that, other parts of Germany, the factories were being bombed by American aircrafts. The supply lines were getting narrower and narrower. People call this D-Day. And from this day, many people say that the war had finished, that was it. There was no way Germany could win the war now. World War II was over on D-Day. Lots of historians would say that. But Germany didn't surrender for another 11 months. It was the 8th of May 1945. We call it VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So the war was won. On D-Day, the war was won. It wasn't over yet. There were still soldiers dodging bullets. There were still soldiers bleeding. Some were still dying. Because they stood between D-Day and VE Day, when the war was over. It's a very confusing place to be. And for us, we're just like those soldiers. Jesus has inaugurated his kingdom. He is on his throne. He's won the victory. But the battle still rages. The kingdom's not yet here in all its fullness. We've seen a partial restoration. As Christians, we know that we're completely forgiven. We're free from sin. We still struggle. We're still tempted. As Christians, we know that God accepts us exactly as we are. We know that we don't have to do anything to impress him. That's amazing, isn't it? But we still try and earn his favor. We still feel crushed if people aren't impressed with us. Sometimes we see relief from diseases. We see miracles. We see medicine working. But not always. People still die. Sometimes we see families restored. We see relationships fixed. Sometimes, partially. And around the world, wars rage. Because God's kingdom's here, it's not here yet, not fully. It's really hard, isn't it? Life is really hard. Lots of things really suck. Lots of things really hurt. But we know how the story ends. Because one day, Jesus is coming. One day our King Jesus will come riding a white horse with eyes like fire, a crown on his head, sword in hand, and heaven's armies behind him. One day our King Jesus will come and get rid of sickness. One day we're going to watch as family members who died not speaking to each other stand together and sing in perfect harmony to the Savior of the world. One day there's going to be no poverty, there's going to be no orphans or widows, because there's going to be no death, because our conquering King will defeat it once and for all. One day. But for now, while we're still on the battlefield, between D-Day and VE Day, God's given us a gift. He's given us the church. Do you know the church is God's plan for the world? Look around the room. Go on. It's awkward, isn't it? How amazing is that? This bunch of ordinary people, some more ordinary than others, it's God's plan for the world. So while we still dodge bullets, while we still bleed and die, God has given us each other, a family on the battlefield. A family under the wings of God. A family who can bring small bits of restoration to a broken world through acts of hesed love. Just like we said about the community in Bethlehem that we see in the book of Ruth, we've got the privilege of being a preview, being a trailer, movie trailer for the restoration that God one day is going to bring to the whole world. Because we should be a place where the poor don't stay poor, where widows, orphans, and refugees are loved, accepted, and looked after, and everyone has what they need. Because we are a kingdom of Hesed. And it's our role to show the world what that kingdom is like. So we need to love the church. Not just Sundays, but particularly Sundays. Because when we gather together, when we take communion, when we worship our King Jesus in song, when we hear from God through his words, we're declaring together that the war has been won. While life may be really difficult, while it sometimes massively sucks, we declare together that one day God will bring restoration. I know that the church has made massive mistakes. We don't always get things right. But God's not going to give up on us. Didn't give up on Abraham. Didn't give up on Judah. Because we are God's plan to restore the world. So Christians, let that lift your spirits this morning. As you go out of here today, be confident in two things. Number one, be confident that you have a family on the battlefield. Number two, that whoever you are, whatever you've done, whatever's been done to you, God plans to restore his world through everyday men and women made in his image, committed to Hesed love. I believe that's what the book of Ruth is all about. We're going to have a song, and then I'm going to get up and just say one more thing, and then we're going to finish. Not for tea and coffee. Thank you.